Hi, I'm really sorry I'm not there and that you're only seeing me by video, because I know there are loads of people in the room that I'd love to catch up with, and I'm sure we will soon. I want to talk to you a little bit about eco-art and art and ecology and stuff like that. Last week I had a cup of tea with Minty to try and catch up and understand what she was hoping for out of this event, what it could do, what sort of conversations might come out of it. And in particular, Minty observed that public art has focused on the sort of issues of history and identity and place recently, very successfully. Scotland's got fabulous examples of really interesting work about place and identity. But there's a need to think about the more than human world, and public art is a way to think about things that are important to us, and it's interesting to think about how public art might expand to deal with the more than human world and what sort of issues might come up. So I want to start from Tim Ingold, and some of you will have read the piece that was published on Eco Art Scotland and got republished by the Nature of Cities about Tim Ingold's recent lecture called The Sustainability of Everything. Tim was very intentionally trying to be provocative. He was trying to say that the sort of ways we think about sustainability at the moment compartmentalize the issue into the sustainability of public transport in Glasgow, or the sustainability of the project after the funding that you are going to receive has been used up. And these sorts of ways of talking about sustainability aren't very helpful. I suppose Tim is very sympathetic, or artists find Tim's way of thinking very sympathetic because it's process-based. In fact, I think I would go further and say I think he's offering an indigenous worldview, maybe based on his fieldwork with the Sami. But he's also been saying something quite provocative recently, which is that actually he thinks that artists, environmental artists in particular, however you want to define it, are more effective at showing us the world in some ways than scientists are at the moment. And that's an interesting thought. So if we take it that we're trying to understand how artists are showing us the world, or what's going on that provokes an anthropologist like Tim Ingold to be more interested in artists' work than scientists, that's quite an interesting trajectory to follow. And it definitely comes back to being interested in more than just the human. So I think that I suggested that public art Minty suggested that public art needs to go beyond just the sort of history and identity. And I think public art has been very successful in becoming part of a sort of placemaking agenda, which now is part of a sort of regeneration agenda. So you've got a whole series of nested ideas there, and it seems like it can be, it's a sort of unqualified good, isn't it? Placemaking is fabulous. What's wrong with placemaking? I think it can I think the question, the more important question, is about belonging, and does public art actually generate a sense of belonging, rather than just creating a nice designed place. So if we want to focus then on keeping in mind the question of belonging as being an absolutely central one, and how we belong, that would be useful. Who belongs in a place? And that's another important question, because actually there are times when public art and artists can kind of go off on a sort of terra nullius. I'm doing a project in Siberia. I'm doing a project here. I'm doing a project there. Nobody else has ever been there. The project I'm doing is completely original and new. and its newness is in part because the place that I'm doing it in is somewhere that no other artist has worked. And I think that actually that's one of the points when I get really anxious. And in fact, I think that doing a project in the immediate vicinity of a studio block with 100 other artists in it is much more interesting, if brave. And I think that, so let's go back to the question of deep ecology. So what we do know about deep ecology is that it is absolutely addressing the question of who belongs, and some of the characteristics of deep ecology thinking are to do with the agency of all things, and thinking about vital matter and the sense that everything is alive and in motion and in process. Even a stone, its time scale might be different, but actually it is in motion and it is in some sense changing over time. It's just that our time scales, we don't experience that very effectively. So in terms, I think that, let me read a quote to you that I came across in trying to begin to get to grips with deep ecology, and I thought this was really useful. So it's talking about David Abram's work. Abram explores what the deep in deep ecology might mean when it's not defined in opposition to conventional reformist sorts of environmentalism. The depth that attracts so many people to the movement was the element of subjective relation to the perceived world, which embedded the human being within the landscape, as opposed to the detached and impartial perspective idealized by modern scientific ways of knowing. The problem isn't necessarily science per se, but rather an exclusive reliance on it in place of the primacy of our bodily embedment in our terrains. So you can see how this connects with Tim Ingold's view, and how the point is to step away from the overriding assumption that the scientific worldview is the only effective one, and to put our own embodied experience back in central place. And I think, just as Tim Ingold says, it's not any particular scientist that's the problem. In some ways, it's the career structures and procedures of institutional science that can become the obstacle rather than any particular scientist. And in fact, interestingly, when I'll come on to talk a little bit more about art and ecology, actually one of the defining characteristics perhaps of art and ecology is the collaboration between the artist and the scientist. And sometimes that might be understood as a way to step out of that detached and impartial perspective, or to put it alongside it another perspective, to make it multivocal rather than monologic. Actually, I want to quote Bill McKibben as well, because he puts another spin on this. He says, in some sense, the physical world is no longer as real to us as the economic world. We cosset and succor to the economy. Our politicians gear every decision to speeding its further growth. And that's quite an interesting, I think in some ways that might be a more astute observation of where the problem really lies. I'll just read it again. In some senses, the physical world is no longer as real to us as the economic world. We cosset and succor to the economy. Our politicians gear every decision to speeding its further growth. Anyway, back to where I was. I was gonna try and draw out some characteristics if we want to go beyond public art and its successful focus on place, history, and identity, and we think that the non-human needs to have to become more a part of this, or maybe not the non-human, but actually the embodied and the shared embodiment. that might be a better way of thinking about it, because it is about our relationship with the rest of the world, not just with our own history and our own development and our own identity, but actually our engagement and our connection with other living things and other things that have agency. So eco art is about being embedded, is about the body, is about the terrain. So I would suggest that ecological art is characterized by a sense of embeddedness, a sense of embodiment, and a connection with terrain. That the work that you see in eco art, yes, is sometimes remediating, is sometimes actually addressing pollution or degradation of the environment and trying to restore that, but it's also sometimes greening, and sometimes it's awareness raising. It's in a cluster of things around there. So it can be very instrumental, or it can be very provocative. But there are a couple of characteristics that are interesting. One of which is that it is, I think, when I think across the sort of spectrum of work, it's very often collaborative, or it's almost consistently collaborative, although that collaboration might be with the non-human. It doesn't mean, when I say collaboration, I know some artists who collaborate with a horse at the moment. Collaboration doesn't have to be with the human, although actually that, as I just mentioned, that issue of collaboration with scientists is pretty central as well. That making ways of understanding the world multiple rather than singular, I think, is vital. I think another aspect, another dimension of that, or a connected dimension, is about education. And I don't mean education in terms of education and outreach departments. I mean that actually art and ecology projects tend to really have as absolutely central an ambition that people who come into contact with the project understand the world differently as a result of their connection with the project. So it's a very fundamental thing about ways of knowing and wanting everyone who connects with the project to experience the world differently as a result. I think that raises a question about what difference if art and ecology wants to make, and I think it's curious. You know, people ask whether public art makes a difference, and who it makes a difference for. And obviously, some art and ecology projects are very functional, are almost instrumental in seeking to be involved in remediation of environments. Some of them think of themselves as like acupuncture, I think, of making a difference by very precise intervention in a very modest way, but into a system where that acupuncture actually has a much wider impact. But actually other projects want to be revolutionary. And if you think about what's gone on with Liberate Tate, that was in some ways both. It was very, very well judged interventions that have had a much bigger impact on a system. You also might want to think about whether the point of an art and ecology project is to achieve catharsis or policy change. And I think that's another interesting dimension. Are you trying to enable people to feel different, or do you want policy to be different? Are those even exclusive to each other? I think probably I'm going to finish now with two thoughts. One of which is that actually both come from Gregory Bateson, and I think that they're useful in terms of thinking. He talks about focusing on the pattern that connects, and I think that's absolutely vital. And he also talks about the difference that makes a difference. And those two sort of rubrics seem to me to be really useful when thinking about a more than human way of making art. Thanks very much for your time.